Welcome back to our study in Nehemiah. Today we wrap it up with the final chapter in chapter 13. And what a journey this has been. I hope that you have taken away many things that you can practically apply as you live out your walk in Jesus Christ in the day-to-day. But unfortunately, today we're not going to end on the same positive note that we began this chapter with. Human nature has crept in and is fully on display. You know, we all make promises to God that we fail to keep. And frequently we make those promises during a time when we are on fire for God, when something has stirred deep in our soul that has caused us to go, I will never do that again. I will turn away from those ways. I'm going to continue, Father, to live and walk for you. I'm making a commitment to be in your word on a regular basis. And so we start out with good intentions, but the busyness of life, the day-to-day, distracts us from our focus on God and Jesus Christ. And before we know it, we've started to backslide or started getting involved in undesirable activities again. General William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, once said to a group of new officers, I want you young men always to bear in mind that it is the nature of a fire to go out. You must keep it stirred and fed and the ashes removed. And so if we're not continuing to feed our soul with the Word of God, to spend time with God in prayer, to spend time with other believers in accountable fellowship and discipleship, we may quickly find ashes building up and the embers beginning to die in the fire and zeal that we have for our God. And then if our key leaders are gone for a while, we may also find ourselves sinking into a period of time where we no longer focus and maybe even forget completely about the promises we've made and the commitment we've made with God. Well, what's happened to the children of Israel is very similar to what happened when Moses went up on Mount Sinai to receive the law of God. Their leader was gone, and they built an idol and sinned greatly. This is similar to what's happening in chapter 13 of Nehemiah. Nehemiah had returned to report to the king and was gone perhaps a year. And when he returns to Jerusalem, he discovers that the situation has deteriorated dramatically. The people failed to keep several of their promises. What did they promise? They promised not to marry foreigners, and they promised that they would take care of the temple. So here's what Nehemiah writes about when he returns. At first, he's going to write down what they promised. So here's what they promised. On that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned that curse into a blessing. So it came about that when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. Well, in previous chapters, particularly in chapter 10, we saw that the people had willingly separated themselves from foreigners. They made promises that their sons and daughters would not marry into other groups. Now, either they did not completely purge themselves of foreigners, or they went ahead and united with the Ammonites and Moabites anyway. Who are the Ammonites and Moabites? Well, Ammon and Moab were born of the incestuous union between Lot and his daughters. You read about that in Genesis 19 and 30 through 38. And their descendants were enemies of the Jews. Their descendants were enemies of the Jews. Now, this is difficult for us today, this agreement that Israel entered into not to marry foreigners. We are New Testament believers, and we have married people from other cultures, but we do have we do have instruction from God's word that as believers, we are not to marry or be unequally yoked with non-believers. So think about that. We've already discussed this in this study, how that can cause issues within the family. Think about the issues that can be caused within a church when individuals who believe things very differently come together to work within a church structure, as we can see, particularly when believers are mixed with unbelievers. How can someone who does not trust the Lord make the financial decisions for a church, or make spiritual decisions for a church, or pray for a church, or hear God's voice about important matters in the life of a church? And yet at times, we will appoint leaders to boards, committees who love the church, but believe Jesus is not the only way, or never really even think about it. So this can cause issues from within. So who was Balaam that's mentioned when Nehemiah begins this chapter? Balaam was a hired prophet who tried to curse Israel, but each time saw the curse turned into a blessing. You read about this in Numbers 22 through 24. He encouraged the Moabites to invite the Jews to share in their religious feast, which involved immorality and idolatry. And God disciplined Israel, and 24,000 people died. So Nehemiah is reminded of this and what can happen to God's people as a result, and what happened when the children of Israel followed the Moabites. They actually began to leave the Lord God Almighty, and they began to worship other gods. Oswald Chambers, he's one of my favorite preachers and writers from the early 20th century. He lived between 1874 and 1917. He's Scottish Baptist, part of the Scottish Baptist and Holiness movement. He was an evangelist, teacher, but he's best known for his devotional book, which are excerpts of his sermons called My Utmost for His Highest. And this is what he wrote back in the early part of the 20th century. He said, "The world has taken so many things out of the church, and the church has taken so many things out of the world, that it is difficult to know where you are." So we've been in trouble for a long time. Vance Havner, considered by many to be the most quoted preacher of the 20th century, wrote this, that we are more beset by traitors within than by foes without. Satan is not fighting churches, he's joining them. So you can see that we're not any different than the people of Nehemiah's day, than the children of Israel. So Israel is going to has promised once again to exclude foreigners, but let's look at what has happened. Now, prior to this, and this is a situation that was already set up, there were struggles. Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God. Now let me go back and explain. This section is Nehemiah is about to explain what's happened while he's been gone. He's been away to report to the king for a year. He's come back, and here's what he found. Eliashib, the priest, had appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, that name should ring a bell, we're going to talk about it, had prepared a large room for Tobiah, where formerly they put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, and the tithes of the grain, wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priest. So Eliashib, the priest, has now set up a room in the temple, the house of God, for Tobiah. But during all this time, I was not in Jerusalem for the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon. I had gone to the king. And after some time, however, I asked to leave the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of our God. And it was very displeasing to me. So I threw out all of Tobiah's household goods. Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the rooms. And I returned there the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings, the frankincense. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. Now, Tobiah, that name sounds familiar. You remember him from the beginning, earlier chapters in Nehemiah. Tobiah was an Ammonite and was related in marriage to the Jews, and he had a son that married into a Jewish family. And now the high priest has allowed Tobiah, given Tobiah a room in the house of God. This is an Ammonite living in the Jewish temple. Eliashib is the high priest, and he was one of the first names on the list in chapter 3 of the workers on the wall. But it appears that he is a traitor. One of his relatives is married to Sanballat, and we heard his name in the beginning as one of the rulers and officials under the king. One of the high priest relatives is married to Sanballat's daughter, and Sanballat was a Moabite. And so it appears that instead of the high priest influencing the foreigners have influenced the high priest. What happened to the leaders that Nehemiah appointed when he was away to lead in his absence? Again, this is very similar to when Moses left and Aaron was left in charge. The leaders were weak, and Aaron was weak, and that weakness showed through during that time the chosen leader was gone. And we see here that Tobiah was robbing, living in the house of God and robbing from the servants of God. Well, Nehemiah immediately takes action. He gives an order, and he has all the rooms cleansed. Tobiah's kicked out along with all his possessions, but he has the rooms cleansed, and the proper utensils and food and offerings he's having to have restored back to the temples. So let's continue and look at what Nehemiah does to help clean up this situation. He says, "So I reprimanded the officials and said, 'Why is the house of God forsaken?' Then I gathered them together and restored them to their post. All Judah then brought the tithe of grain and wine and oil into the storehouses, and in charge of the storehouses I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedadiah of the Levites. And in addition to them was Hanan, the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered," and this is important, "they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me for this, O God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds, which I have performed for the house of my God and its services." In chapter 10, the last verse, verse 39, the last statement the people made in their covenant was with the Lord, and they said this: "We will not forsake the house of our God." Let me ask you, do we have to have Ricky up in the pulpit every Sunday telling us to remember or asking us for our tithes and our offerings in order to honor the commitment that we've made? Every person watching that is a member of a church has made a commitment that you will support that church with your tithes and offerings, with your givings, your gifts, and your servants. Does it take someone from a pulpit being there all the time and constantly reminding us in order for us to honor the agreement and commitment we've made? It shouldn't take a person having to do that. We should do that on our own because we believe in God and Jesus Christ and we trust the church that we're a part of. When Nehemiah returns, well, he's discovered that the people have failed to keep their promises. If your pastor went away for a year, is he going to come back and discover that we failed to keep our promises? The priest and the Levites were without support, and as we saw in verse 9, they had had to go away to their own fields. They fled their post. They had to feed their family. Well, Nehemiah reprimands the officials and quickly puts them back into position, and then sees to it that the people restock the storehouses. What was it that the people Nehemiah chose to supervise and distribute the tithes and offerings? What was it that they had in common? These individuals now that he's put back in place to redistribute all of this. Well, he said they were reliable. That means they were fit to be relied on. They were dependable, giving the same results on successive trials. From Warren Wiersbe's commentary, he says this: when God's people start to decline spiritually, one of the first places it shows up is in their giving. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's in Matthew 6:21. Giving is both the thermostat and the thermometer for the Christian life. It measures our spiritual temperature and also helps set it at the right level. What do you think caused the people to so quickly break their promises? And what can we do to keep from breaking our promises and commitments? What is the danger when we rely on an individual to keep us walking rightly with the Lord? When that individual is gone, are we able to make it? Are we able to make it? We have to have individual responsibility for our spiritual relationship with God. No one else can do it for us, nor should they have to. Well, Nehemiah has a habit of talking to God as he serves him, and we see that in the prayer in verse 14. This prayer is very similar to the prayer we saw in chapter 5, verse 19, when he's saying, God, remember me in all of this. An interesting thing here also is the fact that Nehemiah has overruled the authority of the high priest. Do you know what happened to Jesus when he confronted the priest with their sins? Of course, he was nailed to the cross and crucified. So you better believe that Nehemiah now has even more enemies lurking at the gate and probably very, very serious threats being made against him. One of the other things the people promised is that they promised to keep the Sabbath. So let's see what happened to that particular promise. In those days, I saw in Judah some who were trading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, and they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also, men of Tyre were living there who imported fish, all kinds of merchandise, and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Now remember, we saw this last week. Jerusalem is now a holy city. It is a holy city where its focus is on God, and the temple looms large, overseeing the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Then I, Nehemiah, reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you're adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of my servants at the gate, that no load should enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside the city of Jerusalem. And so you can see all the merchants and the traders lined up outside the gates of Jerusalem, just waiting for those gates to be opened so that they can come in. But Nehemiah steps out and he says, I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? I think about these scenes on the day after Thanksgiving, when people literally camp out Thanksgiving Day and all night, waiting for the stores to open in order to get that bargain. Well, it's a scene, this reminds me of that, a similar scene, camped out in front. But from that time on, after Nehemiah spoke, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also, Nehemiah prays, remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me, according to the greatness of your loving kindness. What are God's children doing now? Well, they're violating Sabbath. Again, another part of the covenant that they promised to keep. Now remember, Sabbath is not for God. It was made for us. And we looked a few weeks ago that Sabbath helps us to discover our freedom from bondage, our freedom from slavery to things. How many of you are a slave to the store? I mean, can we go a day without running to the local market? Can we? Can we make it a day without that trip? Or have we become such slaves to running to the grocery store each day that we can't stop it? And it's also designed to help us establish reliability on God in our lives. I need something. I've left that ingredient out and I really want to cook this dish. I'm just going to run to the store. Whoops. I really could use some paper towels. I'm going to run to the store on the Sabbath. And we never take a break. We never take a break from commerce in our lives. Have we become slaves to commerce? Well, Sabbath exists to get us out of bondage, to help us understand freedom, and to help us rely on God's provision. So they promised to do that, and then they walked away. We've mentioned this already. They promised not to marry or align with foreigners, take foreigners as spouses. So verse 23, Nehemiah writes, in those days I also saw the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, it's so important. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them. Listen to how Nehemiah responds. This is not what we would typically think of Nehemiah. He says, so I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Wow. The action Nehemiah takes here seems drastic to us. Earlier I asked, what was it that caused the people to change so quickly? And here is the answer. It is foreign marriages. We have a lot of difficulty relating to this section today because we are people of the New Testament. There are two dispensations, some of us read it as two dispensations in some denominations, not because of any difference in the attitude of God toward sin, but to a difference in the understanding and background of the people under two dispensations. So it was necessary, and again, that just depends on what denomination you're from, on how you teach about that. In the Methodist Church, we consider the Old Testament and the New Testament equally relevant in how we live our lives. It was necessary in the time of Nehemiah, however, that sin be clearly branded and that the people of God be kept strictly separate from the influence of a sinful nation of that time. And that's the way that God's redemptive plan was going to take place in due season. His redemptive plan needed to be carried out, and all the people of the world be given the opportunity to receive the benefits of salvation. God had to establish a pure people group. And Ezra, we see that Ezra dealt with these same issues and situations as we look at the book of Ezra. When Israel married foreigners, Israel did not lead foreigners to Yahweh God. Foreigners led Israel away. And again, we've talked about this before. In our Christian walk, when we make a decision to marry an unbeliever, it's not that God doesn't care for that unbeliever. It's not that God doesn't offer his love for that unbeliever through Jesus Christ. But when we make that decision, more often than not, rather than our leading that individual to Christ, that individual will lead us away. We'll quit going to church, maybe not spend as much time in the Word, and we'll find our relationship with God becomes more and more one of a distant relationship. I think I mentioned this before. I've had numerous people over the years tell me, well, my teenager will no longer come to church because, and usually it's women that come and tell me this, because they say, Daddy gets to sit home and watch TV, and I'm trying to drag my kid to church and they won't go anymore. Why do we have to go when Daddy doesn't have to? And it becomes a real problem in the home as well. And most of the time, the teenager quits coming and draws further and further away from the teachings of God. Well, we see that the children have been raised now in such a way that they no longer speak their language, the language. They don't know their heritage. The grandson of Eliashib the high priest had married a daughter of Sanballat, the greatest enemy of the Jews in that period. So Nehemiah responds here very quickly. He even pulls out the hair or beards of the men who disobeyed. Why? Well, in that particular day and time, this was a sign of humiliation. He cursed them. He showed them how serious their sin was and showed them what their sin deserved. He denounced judgments of God against them. Now, let me ask you this. If I saw you about to drink poison, and I knew that it was deadly poison, how would you want me to respond? How would you want me to respond? What if I just thought about myself? I wouldn't drink that, but I don't want to impose my views on him. Each person has a right to his own opinions. No, that's not what you'd want. You'd want me to shout. You'd want me to yell. You'd want me to say, wait, that'll kill you. And if need be, you want me to knock that drink out of your hand. And Nehemiah is telling them how serious this is. You've just returned from slavery and bondage, and God is going to send you right back from whence you came under a yoke of slavery. And that's what Nehemiah's doing here. He's shaking them up. He's helping them understand the reality of their situation. Because of your doing this in the past, it brought about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it sent you into slavery. Nehemiah didn't worry about being polite or about what people would think of him or about the threats that would come his way. I'm sure that he made many enemies here, but I'm also sure that he was God's friend. This matter is such a serious problem for Israel that it's actually how this marvelous book ends. I told you it didn't end on the same positive note it ended at the beginning, but it ends with Nehemiah reminding them of their past. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. So I drove him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priest and the Levites, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of the wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good, for good. To deal with spiritual permissiveness, we have to be aware of the problem areas. Why hadn't others in Israel dealt with these problems? Ezra, the thought is, may have died by now in 1313 in Ezra. Zadok is called the scribe and perhaps indicates that Ezra no longer held that post. Perhaps the other leaders just didn't see the problem to the degree that Nehemiah did. You know, often missionaries who have gone from the United States for a few years are shocked when they return and they see the moral decline here. And we may sense that, like the frog in the pot, that the water's beginning to get hot, but we don't jump out of it soon enough before it cooks us. We're living in it. We don't see it. And so when somebody goes away and comes back, it jumps out at them. It shocks them. We need to understand that marrying an unbeliever will not only affect us, it also has a negative impact on our children. Will they grow up speaking the language of God and Jesus Christ? Will they grow up understanding the things of God? And it certainly makes our job as believers much more difficult. And another question that I think about, how do we know when to be restrained and gentle and when to be bold, even emotional in confronting someone about sin? Well, you have to be extremely prayed up and deal with the own issues in your life before God, before you tackle that speck in someone else's eye. So I think as I look at this, that Nehemiah shot up these brief prayers to God to remember him and his enemies because he was under severe attack. Father, remember me. Please note what I'm doing here to bring honor to you, because I've got a lot of threats. I've got enemies breathing down my back, and I'm now in danger. You don't do what Nehemiah did without incurring the wrath of those whose comfortable lifestyles you upset. So that's where this book ends. And so I want to go back now as we conclude and recap some of the things that we've learned in this wonderful book. We learned that Nehemiah cared enough to ask for the facts. How do we apply that to our lives today? Do we care enough about a situation to ask for the facts? Do you care enough about what's happening in your church today to spend time looking at the facts? Nehemiah listened and heard what was said. So not only did he investigate, but he paid attention. He listened when people spoke and reported. He heard. We see that it caused grief. He wept over what he discovered and what he heard. He wept over the needs. Have we wept? Have you and I wept over what's happening in our church today? Have we truly listened? Do we understand? Have we paid attention to the facts? And are we weeping over the challenges we're facing in our church? Nehemiah then prayed and fasted. Have we done that? Really, have we genuinely done that in regards to what's happening in our church? And then, and I'm sorry, I'm beginning to lose my voice, but then we see that Nehemiah waited for God's timing. And that's here at Guntersville First Methodist. We're in what's called the discernment process right now. It is a very biblical time of waiting to hear from God, waiting to gather facts, waiting to hear from God before we act. And then after Nehemiah hears from God, he acts. He volunteers to get the job done. Have you stepped forward? Have you volunteered to participate and help get the job done? And then we see that Nehemiah worked hard. He rolled up his sleeves. He had a mind to work. Are you just running your mouth? Or do you have a mind to roll up your sleeves and work and get dirty and get involved as we move forward and rebuild? And Nehemiah had a plan. He didn't come before the king just with an idea. He had a plan on how that should be implemented and how to go forward. Are you just full of ideas that don't go anywhere? Or has God actually given you a plan with specifics on how to go forward? If it is from God, based on what we've seen in Nehemiah, he will give specifics on how to move forward and on the plan. Nehemiah also was not a lone wolf. He enlisted the help of others. We do not serve alone. It takes a team. Nehemiah knew his enemy. He discerned, he prayed, he knew his enemy. Do you know our enemy? Do you know Satan? Are you familiar with his ways and how he works? Or are you so unfamiliar that you're constantly being tripped up by the enemy? Nehemiah watched because he knew the enemy was there and around. He watched for the enemy. Nehemiah practiced what he preached. Are you practicing what you're preaching with your mouth? Nehemiah had the faith to stand firm in the midst of controversy and adversity. And Nehemiah glorified God. Keywords: cared, listened, heard, wept, prayed, fasted, waited, acted, volunteered, worked, had a plan, enlisted, motivated, encouraged, discerned, knew, watched, practiced, had faith, glorified. These are just a few things about this man chosen by God, placed in his position by God, equipped by God, and yet at any given time, he could have chosen to walk away from God. And guess what? God would have let him. He could have said, the task is too much for me. I'm not taking this on. And God would have allowed him to walk away. In John chapter 17, verse 4, Jesus said, I have glorified thee on the earth, having accomplished the work which thou hast given me to do. The next time you feel like quitting, maybe in the midst of what's going on in the United Methodist Church right now, you feel like quitting. Remember Nehemiah. Stay on the job until the work is finished and brings glory to God. I hope you have a blessed rest of your week. Let me encourage you to go to our website at www.gfumc.net. We have a lot of new classes that are going to be beginning in the next few weeks. So if you'll go to our website, you'll see the times and locations for those classes. And also some of them do require registration. So please find a class and continue joining others in the study of the Word of God.